Hello, composers.
Hi.
Hello.
This is a very special stream because of two reasons. We have the countdown back, and that makes Shantim very happy. And it's Megan's birthday stream too. So happy birthday, Megan!
Thank you.
Happy birthday.
Happy
Thank you.
birthday! It was great as you told us. But
Uh-huh.
and we're gonna speak about your favorite topic too. It
One of my
seems.
favorites, yeah.
Well, at least one of your favorites. It seems. And that is notation. So, how should we begin this? Talking about
Um,
software? What software do
yeah.
you use, Megan? What software do you use?
Um, well, I've had experience with a lot of the softwares. I wouldn't say all of them. For my work for, I guess since probably around 2008 or 9, I've been using InDesign, Adobe InDesign. So it's graphic arts software exclusively for my work. Yeah, I like that anything you can, it doesn't feel limiting and I typically, before that, did use Sibelius, and I got pretty good at pushing that pretty hard into some graphical types of things. And a lot of my musical, like clefs and notes, if I have those in my pieces, those fonts do get imported from Sibelius onto my Adobe InDesign. And I still use Sibelius for uh, theory teaching, for teaching work. Yeah, and I back when I was in college, I used both Sibelius and Finale a little bit. I used to do a lot of work as a copy editor as well. So, um,
Well, it seems
think,
like you're safer than Shunting and I because Shunting and I use Finale, and Finale has come to an end pretty
well,
much.
Yep.
yes and no. I think probably Adobe InDesign is a pretty safe platform. It's an expensive platform because you can no longer you can no longer purchase the software. You have to rent it um, month to month, and older versions don't no longer work. Um, so that's kind of stinks. It's a great software, except for that aspect of it. Um, and I mean,
It's a subscription,
Sibelius is
baby.
fine. Like, I use that for teaching, but as far as I understand, that it's very likely Sibelius will have that same sort of fate.
Well, I think we have to, Shunting and I think we have to learn Dorico, right?
Yeah, I guess.
I'm guessing. I don't know.
Have you
Have
guys
you,
done?
have you made the move?
I actually before the end of finale, I mean before the announcement of such a tragic fate, I downloaded the installer and gave it a try. I didn't like it actually.
You didn't
Uh,
like.
I
Okay.
didn't like it, but
I did
Why?
a lot.
now the switch seems to be more inevitable.
It's
So
mandatory or something because well, we have a few options. We have Lillipond, which is more like a programming software,
yep.
or so I understand. And we have MuseScore. You said, Megan.
Yeah, so
That's what you're using
MuseScore.
against the
So a lot of people are talking about that one because it's open source. So the future of that program seems more clear just because it's open source and it's a free software. I have almost all my students use it, I will say, because of it's free, and it's pretty impressive for a free software, but it's not, in my opinion. I haven't delved into it really deeply, but from what I've seen my students do and the problems they have to it, it doesn't seem to be quite like a professional level software. uh, Definitely great if you're just trying to do, write some chorales for like a theory class or do something quick like that, but not necessarily for contemporary music.
Yeah, and that's the thing with all of this, that we must be able to manipulate the program, not just to notate in conventional terms, just but to notate what we want it to notate,
Yeah.
to write down. And I think
Go
that
to the dark side like me of go to graphic art
I
software.
think that you have the most practical approach to it all, because in the end, that's a lot of what we do is kind of like use a lot of symbols or new symbols and instructions. But I will say that your approach is a bit more extreme than Shunting or I.
Yeah, sort there are certain aspects to it that are much easier, and there's certain aspects depending on what you're doing too that are much harder. Um, like if I'm it won't automatically, it won't like render parts for me. I have to actually copy lines and put them on a new to if I'm making parts.
But that's what I did. Like,
Yeah,
did you
oftentimes you
ever?
have to do that anyway.
I did my parts manually most of, yeah, all of the time. I never use the feature to grab the parts automatically. Did you ever use that, Shunting, with Finale?
You finale?
To
Which
make parts, automatic parts.
kind of, but you need to add it. You need to heavily add it every
Yeah,
part they make.
that's how Sibelius is too. You have to highly
Y-
edit.
What I did was delete everything else and leave only the staves of the part, and then revise it manually, because it will mess up everything anyway when you try to do
Yeah,
it
I mean,
automatically.
the other option would be just writing stuff out by hand, which I remember in grad school, two of our colleagues, Rob Phillips and David Rappenecker, both took that route, and they had gorgeous looking scores.
Handwriting. Well, it's an option, but for me, I always begin my scores with handwriting, but then we'll go on to engrave them on Finale.
It's a lot of patience though, because they had all the different tools for handwriting. Like they had the different um, tools to get different shape, the different grade. Like how in music notation there are all these different weighted lines.
Uh huh.
Yeah, so they had like all those tools for that. It's almost like calligraphy and art to it. And I do paint and draw, but I don't know if I'd have the patience for that sort of work. But it's beautiful.
Yeah, I kind of remember Rob's notation and a bit of Rappinecker's notation, and the people that still kind of have a very nice handwriting can publish their scores but in handwriting, but I don't think that I could. It pretty much, my handwriting is not that good, because probably because I write too fast, probably because I only see it as a means to an end, a means to notate or remember my ideas quickly so I can transcribe that to the end product, which makes me think if we have become too dependent on notation software in a way. Probably we have, I think. Probably we should just go back to handwriting and pay somebody
I mean, I
to.
do think for sure, as a teacher, I think student composers are much too reliant on notation software, and particularly the playback
The MIDI playback,
features,
the Apple MIDI playback.
which I never used the MIDI playback ever. Like it's just how I was trained. I was trained, and the MIDI playback when I was like a high schooler was really. I mean, it's still terrible, but it was even more terrible. So yeah, it was just not an option I ever used, and not then by the time I got to be about 20, I wrote music that couldn't even be realized by MIDI. So Yeah, but it's such a crutch for young composers that they.
I
I
think that
understand that it's hard to get performers to learn your music and play your music, and it feels like a way that you can just hear your music and have it not be abstract because the paper is so abstract. I understand the draw to it, but I do see it, especially after a certain level, beyond like if they're beyond the point of just very basic, learning about like voice leading, and how a harmony works and how to make congruent lines, like really simple ideas. If they're beyond that, I see it holding them back from developing it as a composer.
I think that the way they see it is the way you see a sequencer. You already have a laid out space. There's a special aspect to writing music that you can expand it or compress it when you are handwriting, or when you come from a background of handwriting, and then start using programs and for try to do make them do what you want, not try to confine yourself to the limitations of the program. That's kind of half the battle, you might say it that way, kind of like, um, because the programs are always going to try and make you write in a more conventional way, are gonna try to limit you, just like a sequencer does in electronic music. So it's kind of like, if they rely too much, if students rely too much on the software, in a way they are limiting themselves and their imagination, is what I think.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say, Shanti?
Um,
What's your process?
I prefer to use pencil and paper, but
From,
using a
start
software
to
is
finish, you mean?
hmm?
From start to finish of the piece?
At least the sketches or the draft.
Yeah, yeah,
Be-
yeah, I kind of do
Yeah, I
too.
mean, I'm the same way.
But it is more convenient, definitely, if you can start from the scratch with software, because it is easier to make changes, especially if you just want to make tiny changes. Um, yeah, if you are using like paper and pencil, you may need to rewrite a lot. You may need to
Mm-hmm.
erase a lot, or even rewrite the whole thing if you are going to make a lot of major changes. So using a computer can be, I mean, can be way more convenient, in the sense that if you are going to change a lot, or if you feel really bad for any so-called mistakes, or any like revision that you want to make so urgently, because I guess sometimes we can wait. I mean, for example, you write such a passage, and then you may think that, oh, I can wait for like 2 days to revise it. I don't need to perfect it in one sitting. Then I think this is easier to use paper and pencil. But I guess if you have like OCD, that you must change everything, that you can help, you must change it whenever you have some other ideas in your head, then maybe using a software will be way more convenient, because changing, revising, or is so much easier. And and not to mention that you can copy and paste. If you know that you have like two passages
Yeah.
that are pretty similar, you only need to transpose or reorder some of the stuff. Maybe a software can help you. I remember a professor in the past told us that, um he said, JS Spark used to copy a lot of music from other masters, but perhaps JS
Mm-hmm.
Spark want a photocopier. Yeah, maybe technology can help us a lot, I
So
guess.
are your drafts typically like fully playable reading and scores? Because I write my drafts also by hand, but I don't come into the the problems that you have because I just don't make them very neat. And so I scribble things out. I might have arrows or different patterns. I might label things and then reorder them. I might just make a note, be like, go back to this part or whatever. Definitely would not be at all readable, like even remotely readable by a human, but it's enough for me to remember what I wanted to write and me to kind of process my ideas until I get to the point where I want to then put it on a computer and then neatly write it out. But it sounds like, yeah, your drafts sound more thorough than mine, I think.
Try to be readable, but usually end up being truly messy. Messy to the point that I think I can understand what I'm trying to sketch, but I don't think
Yeah.
anybody would appreciate it at all.
See,
Yeah.
mine were really, really pretty much not readable. Like David Felder literally refused to look at my drafts because he just didn't. They were just like they still are. And then I would say they're probably better than they used to be because they had a lot more descriptions on them. Like they used to be like just big like shapes and stuff where I had a better memory and I would just kind of remember what those meant. But now most of the details are laid out in usually text form though. Like most of the time, if I do have pitches, for whatever reason I usually work on plain paper, and even if I do have a part that has like rhythm and pitches, the rhythm and pitches are notated separately and in like and oftentimes I have a lot of like text in them, which is not necessarily how the final score will read.
Yeah, I can show a bit of one of your pieces, like the first page,
yeah.
if you want. Like,
Yeah, sure.
give me a second here. So we can see what you mean.
But they're not.
There we go.
So and this is the final, not the draft. So yeah, so you can tell like
There's
some of
speeches.
this stuff. This is definitely pitches. Yeah, and I think in the original, I think I had all these notes as just like X's, and I then just wrote the pitches like in a stack. Like I would write this as like a C#4. I would write it very technically, like in text.
Okay.
Yeah.
But then
No.
it's like toggle complete range of volume, retardando for 30 seconds. There are no rhythms, no real rhythms written.
Not
out.
here. No, I don't think in this piece much at all, to be honest.
It's like repeat. Well, there's a rhythm here, kind of, but
Kinda.
yeah, it's more about the toggling, about the instructions of how to manage the
There's a little
knot,
rhythm here.
the pitch bends with the left hand improvised descending half step gestures. I think that this is your last piece, so we can say this was your more mature in a way. There's a lot of text improvised using only series of descending minor.
I will say like my drafts have probably even more text because I don't take the effort to write everything out, like draw everything out this graphically. I try to go really super fast. But yeah, the notation software using, and I would say that piece is not the furthest I've done things that have been even much more graphic, I think, in the past too. But even with that piece, you can kind of see like a lot of the things are beyond what you could easily do, even if you're very good at tricking one of the music note softwares.
But I think that it kind of prepares something like this, watching uh, only watching at the score, it prepares psychologically the performer to kind of play in a different way than he or she will usually do it, right? Wouldn't you say so?
Yeah,
Kind of
yeah.
prepare the performer to play new music or Megan's music, let's say more idiosyncratic music of what the
Yeah,
performers
I
should
mean,
do.
for me, I wouldn't say I don't think about it like that, but I don't know. So I think that I don't necessarily create gestures that are so when we have traditional music notation, there's usually a lot of like we might have like a whole note or something. There's a lot of things that go into it's such an abstract thing. Then there's a lot of things that go into playing that whole note. Um, like even if I were to play it on horn, like I would have to, articulate. I have to breathe. I have to buzz. I have to produce a certain volume, certain dynamics, certain timbre, there's all these things that it's just like one graphic. And I don't necessarily always think of all these things together as we do in music. For most instruments, there's like a lot of, there's a certain way of treating the instruments, and usually that way involves us kind of linking a bunch of different physical characteristics together. And so I try to I try to imagine like, oh, if I didn't know, what this, piece of material, whether it's an instrument I'm building from scratch or if it's like a violin or whatever it is, I try to imagine like if I didn't know what it was supposed to do, like how might I interact with it? And like I treat it more like the actual physical materials, and it's hard to do, especially as somebody who is very highly classically trained. And so like that not necessarily I think it's kind of intuitive to me now because I've been treating instruments this way for so long, but it definitely wasn't as I was a young composer, and it's not something I did when I was a super young composer. But yeah, I think I like to create new relationships, and I like to have the performer be more present than the instrument on the stage. And yeah, oftentimes the traditional notation just doesn't accomplish that because it's just not designed to do that, because it's linking things that I don't necessarily want to link together. So because of that, I often have to create these new notations and new systems. I have many, like most of my pieces have
Their own system.
they're all some kind of original notation wise. There are certain types of notation, like general types I like to do, but none of them are exactly the same. They have to do with instrumentation. But I also have a hard time because, a lot of my pieces do look very beautiful. My scores, like people will like looking at my scores. They'll be really interested in the scores. And like I work really hard on the scores, and I am like kind of a professional. I'm a very visual person, and I'm very kind of detail oriented. So like I do work really hard on them, but at the same time, like I don't want the scores like to be the music, if that makes sense. Like I want I want the scores to convey the necessary information to the performer, but then like the actual performance is like what I consider the art and not the notation, which is very different than a lot of other composers that I tend to get linked with. A lot of composers who do use graphic art software do get linked into finding the notation to be more important than the result, or at least equal important as the result. Which is not where I have, and I do have I have pieces that have the notation is less,
The thing is that depending on the performer, I can imagine the music being different, because when you see something like
Mhm.
this, you will have either a reaction that is kind of enticing, excited to play this music, to go into this score and discover it, or either that, or there's doesn't seem to be a middle ground. Either that or a high resistance against the score, against
Yeah,
the
I
music
mean,
or something,
I
because
think
it's
for
not that
me,
different. Let's compare it to some of my music. It's like this is very conventional. You will see
yeah,
a piano player and say, okay, well, yeah, this is how it should be played. But then if you confront him with something like this, it's like, wait, I have to think about it. I have to get into it. I have to
yeah.
figure it
I mean,
out.
I think you're right, but at the same time, and I used to be very concerned with that, but at the same time, I think for all of us, how many times do we have pieces? I mean, I think we'd all love for many performers to play our music, but how many times do we actually have to write a piece that many performers actually take it on, many different performers, and learn it? And so because that happens so infrequently, and if it was like one or two, and usually if that did happen, the person was really just excited and engaged and wanted to put forth that effort, that I just at this point I have just stopped writing gearing my pieces and the musicality and artistry of the piece so that many performers could or would play it, because in honestly, probably I'll have the one player that will play it. Maybe if I'm lucky, they'll play it a few times or whatever. But I think that was kind of freeing for me, because I like that piece. I wrote it for my friend Andrew Davidson, and I thought of him playing it. And if somebody else wants to play it after he premieres it, it would, they're totally welcome. I would love to work with other people, but I didn't necessarily write the piece for that situation. I wrote it considering Kim and his knowledge of my music, which is a lot. And not every situation I write is like that, but yeah, I try not to worry about the multitudes of performers learning my music anymore. I definitely used to worry about that a lot.
So would you say they are tailor made then, your pieces?
Yeah, I think most of them. I think most of them, and I think the better ones are. The pieces I have some pieces that I've written more generically for a random group or a reading or something, that I think those pieces that I didn't really have any relationship with the performers or whatever, and I'm just writing a piece for instrumentation. I think those become the most bland of all my pieces. Yeah, I think I always like to think about Liaison, my piano dancer work. So that piece, when I worked with Dancer, she played by memory. She didn't actually have any relationship with the score. I had lots of notes and really rough drafts, like I talked about, written, because that's my mind works in paper. I don't memorize things very easily, and we videotaped absolutely everything we did. Sections we worked on, improvisation, literally hours and hours and hours of footage every week of us working on it. And when it premiered, there was no score whatsoever. But it was, the piece was performed the same. The instrument doesn't always react the same. There's indeterminacy with the instrument, and a little bit with the physical body, but the intention is, it's not. The intention to produce sound and movement is always the same every time. So she just learned it by memory, and we worked on it together. And the score was created after the premiere, mostly only to be able to be included in my portfolio for in grad school. That's the only reason it exists. And I like that experience. I mean, I don't think we'll get it very often, but I like that experience of just being able to kind of directly work. Because I mean, it took a lot of time. Obviously, it's much more time consuming. But
Yeah, we
Yeah.
all need the document for school at least.
yeah, so
Yeah.
there, and I would say like my piece for Andrew, because he knows my music very well, and I think the notation is maybe less detailed than notation that I've made for performers that don't know my music as well. Yeah.
I have here an old shunting piece. Well, from 2021. Do you remember this one, Pang?
Yeah, kind of.
Can you say anything about it?
It is it's a piano solo piece, I guess.
No.
Although,
Oh,
is it?
I think that in the end it became a marimba piece. Oh no, it says piano piece, but for some reason it was in my marimba folder. But yeah, it's a piano piece for sure.
Yeah, it's a piano piece. I believe I wrote it for the what how do you call that? The international like new music festival in St. Petersburg in Russia. Yeah, I believe so. And yeah, this one I didn't didn't sketch at all. I just wrote it on the software. Yeah.
How would you say it yielded a different result? Or did it?
I think it's okay for me. Actually, I don't think I need to sketch or draft a lot sometimes. But because I play the piano myself, so
Very contrapuntal.
I
Mhm.
practice it. And try to compose. I mean, try to write what I play, and sometimes I play what I write. So, but I think perhaps because of the lack of like pre-compositional planning, there are some parts that I don't really like. I found some of the parts a little bit like conventional or cliche. Yeah. For example, I think in the middle of the piece I had like a bunch of like 30-second notes or 16th notes, and then I asked the pianist to play very fast and and had a crescendo. Yeah, somewhere like this. I think it's pretty cliche. Yeah, limited by my own playing capability. Yeah. Yeah, but because of this, I got to understand the importance of like pre-compositional planning. Yeah,
Yeah.
because we need to find out what's we need to find out what is in our head, and in addition, we need to formulate some other strategies to make use of the materials in our head. So I think sketching or planning is still very important, even if we can like write a lot of stuff on the paper or on the computer. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I
Yeah.
guess we can conclude that the visual aspect is very important to how the sonic aspect or the aural aspect is gonna be in the end. But
How do you
yeah,
think about like I a lot of times like with my theory students I'll talk about there's so some composers have a stronger look to their scores. For example, like if you look at a piece by Bach, even if it was just on a piece of paper and you like glance at it for a second, it has a look to it. Like you couldn't tell it's like Bach
Mhm.
in a way that Beethoven, for example, I don't think has that strong of a look until you actually sit down and read the notes and play. Like it doesn't have just a glance like as strong of a look to it. Um, I think Shanti's music actually. I think you're doing the scores. I think his music has a look to it. I don't know what about it. What about it? But it's just like the scores look like his music. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what. I mean, and obviously, like I enjoy both Bach and Beethoven's music. It's just kind of something I noticed that some composers have
personality,
in their notation
individuality.
and others don't.
I can see what you mean. Definitely, it's kind of like putting a stamp on like handwriting with a program in a way.
Hmm.
You might say so. You might say that. Well, the way that I view a notation, at least, it's very, very tight. I don't know if it shows in the music, but it's very tied to the kind of a line that goes along, or a snowball. Like now that I look at it, it seems very logical from going from one point to the other. At least to me, it's kind of like the development seems very natural in a way, you might say, kind of like um how one thing grows from another. I don't If I see it like this from an overview from afar, it's kind of like, okay, there's recurrent material, like this comes from the beginning, but
Hmm.
I kind of like think musically. I write like I will write an essay, you might say, like from a sentence to a sentence, how I connect sentences in a way, like, okay, this is my way of saying this as a whole paragraph, but from sentence to sentence, it has to make sense. At least that's how I think about notation, as a straight line, as a you might say that it's kind of through composed in a way, although there are many ways in which it is pre-planned and that I have sketches and stuff like that. But I can see, at least now that I'm watching it like from afar, like how there's a process unfolding, how there's a discourse that wants to say something, that wants to doesn't want to mash many ideas at the same time, wants to be eloquent in a way, or something like that. Is what I have to say about my notation in a way.
Notation. So I think notation is something that makes music different than other art forms. And I think it has a much more integral part, and it makes composition very different because if we were like a visual artist, you could make a line or a stroke or whatever, and that would be something that would eventually could be meaningful to the viewer. Um, but we just make symbols and fairly abstract symbols at that, like that, especially if we're talking about just traditional notation, like if we're asking somebody to play like an F sharp, there's nothing like they actually there's nothing about the symbol that shows them how to play it or how to interpret that. They actually have to, kind of take that abstract symbol and make something of it and play that and use their knowledge of the instrument to be able to produce that note. Yeah, and there's so many, subtleties like oftentimes as a performer you kind of have to know the articulation language or the vibrato language or the timbre language to get the right style of the piece beyond what's like often in notation. Yeah, and so as composers we're just writing, we're making notation. That's what we're doing, and we hope this notation will help guide performers to produce an interesting piece of music. But yeah, there's so many layers that you don't regularly see that in other art forms that I'm aware of.
What you're talking about is the communication aspect, right?
Uh-huh.
How we communicate with performers, and in turn, it's like because we are the senders of a message to the performer. We have this idea in our head, these sounds in our head, and we kind of try the performer to give them life to those sounds. But the performer then in turn turns from the receiver of the message to the sender of the message of the to the audience. So there's kind of like two steps in order to get the music directly to the audience, to the public, to the listener. So the original intention would be for the music to the sounds, the organized sounds to get out to the listener, right? That's what we are thinking. We are thinking like, how is the audience gonna receive it? But in a sense, there's a middle aspect or a middle ground, an interpretative aspect that is represented by the performer. So we must communicate first with the performer and then communicate with the audience, which makes it a
Mm-hmm.
complex, much more complex process in the end, right? I was
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of like the way I try, I'm not always able to do it, but I try to do it, and I see a lot of other temper composers kind of coming to the same solution. As I try to work with my performers in person when I have the chance, as much as I can, because I feel like I can convey much more information that way than I can through just handing them pieces of paper. Um, yeah, and you see, I mean, lots of composers are our generation, but even much older, like Helmut Lackermann. Much of his career, he traveled and showed people his sounds and to try to get
we
people
have
to get his vision. Yeah.
yeah. The thing is that well, what can we do if we are not there? We try to overnotate. Is the other thing
Mhm.
we can do, right? But the
Yeah,
thing
but
that
sometimes that's intimidating to performers. Like sometimes I feel like I do probably do that's probably what I would do in that situation. But sometimes that can turn a player, I think, away from a piece because they just see this influx of information and they get overwhelmed.
well, yeah, but the thing is that in the end is a communication tool. Like Felder used to say in the seminar, uh, the score itself is only a fiction. It's not alive. It's if it's not it doesn't come alive. It's it if it isn't interpreted by somebody, by a performer, then it's useless. It's pretty much useless.
Hmm.
Like, well, unless you want to put those pretty scores in an art gallery and kind of like have your exhibition of scores, of graphical scores, for example, or stuff like that,
Mhm.
then it's pretty much useless because what's the intention? The intention is to communicate sound. And if you don't communicate it effectively, first to the performer so he can communicate it to the listener, then what are you doing? It's kind of a worthless process, useless. It's futile. Is the word I'm looking
Mhm.
for. For
I
like yes, Shanti.
I'm when I was much younger, I used to put in as much information as possible. I added quite a lot of details, even for a very tiny space. So gradually, when I get older and older, I started to think perhaps the performers didn't want to see so many markings on my music, and I imagine more and more how the performers may perceive the information from my score. I I try to imitate their gesture. For example, I imagine myself as a violinist if I need to write it for like a string quartet or something like that. And then and also I will ask myself if that marking is necessary. For example, so I keep on asking myself these kind of questions. For example, if the music begin, let's say if there's a long note begin on the on the let's say the final 16th notes of a 4/4 measures, and then it is tying over to the to the next measure. Then I will ask, hey, it begins in on offbeat. Should I articulate it? If not, does it really matter if to begin on such a place? Because if it is so important to be that accurate, maybe I should articulate that notes. But if I don't articulate such a note, maybe I don't have to be that specific in terms of the rhythm. I will ask myself this type of question, and
Mhm.
I think nowadays I still over notate a lot of stuff, but I tend to cut down my details a little bit. Yeah, I'm not saying that I'm a saint or like a guru in terms of notation, but I try to ask myself a lot of questions when I put in some kind of like complicated or unusual things on the score. Yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
I tend to overnotate, but I don't expect the performer to do everything I write down. I overnotate. I'm the more specific as I am as specific as I can be, but for myself to remind myself of what's the purpose of each note of each passage, of what is like they are kind of like footnotes for myself. If I put a staccato, if I put a whatever marking over a note that may over a fast passage, you may not even know if it's a staccato passage or if it's a legato passage. If it's a
Mhm.
fast enough uh, passage, no, especially on instruments like the marimba and stuff like that. But I come to think of it like it's more like for myself to remember, to remind myself of what's the purpose of a specific passage, of a specific section, of a specific note, and stuff like that. It's kind of like
Yeah.
um, it's an interplay. Of course, I want it to come across in the music, but sometimes I don't expect it to come across. I know that it's not practical to notate it in a certain way, but it's kind of like how I imagine the overall sound. Like if it's more wet or more dry, like I notate it a certain way. Do you know what I mean? What I'm trying to say?
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, I think for me too, like I write. There are times in general I have a pretty clear idea of what my music sounds like. I don't think people think I do, but I think in general I do. There are times that I am a little bit experimental, that I break apart different elements in ways that I don't exactly know how I'm not 100% sure they're combined. I usually have a pretty decent idea. Yeah, but the what I always guides me is when I was studying at Northwestern with J.L. and Yim, he used to always say that you had to notate well enough or specific enough so that the worst possible still accurate notation or interpretation. So this is assuming good quality musicians and they're playing everything you have on the paper correctly. The worst possible interpretation, assuming that, would still be the one that you would enjoy. So I do think about that a lot. When I add in details, like there are certain times when I'm very specific because I'm trying to create a certain type of physical energy, and sometimes subtle changes will completely change the physical energy. But there's other times that I have maybe a general goal, but I don't necessarily have it so specific that there's no room for the performer. So it changes. But I think about that idea a lot. That like how could one take what I'm producing and interpret it without making any like mistakes or not reading all the information or whatever, but they're just taking from a technical manner everything that's on the page and like making something. Like what kind of gamut do I want and to express like to them.
And probably that's kind of like it's very well expressed in your music because you are, I would say that you're the most specific, like writing out exactly what you want and stuff like that. It's like out of the three of us.
Yeah,
That's
I mean, well, because I think a lot of times I'm very interested in like physical fatigue, and sometimes like players not always being physically comfortable doing whatever it is on stage. Like sometimes I'm asking them to work in ways that's not physically intuitive on their instruments or on their bodies. And I mean, intuitively we move our bodies in intuitive ways. We play our instruments in intuitive ways that fit in our in our hands. And so if I'm asking them not to do that, I kind of have to put enough detail in so that they'll won't adapt it to be comfortable. Yeah, if that makes any sense, because
yeah, yeah. But well, you almost always write for small ensembles, like one, two, three people. But I think that Shunting has
yeah.
more experience dealing with different types of ensembles. What would you say changes, Shunting?
Changes? You mean the notation?
Yeah,
The
like
style?
between an orchestra piece or a chamber piece or something.
I think when I compose for like a slightly bigger group, I will become very concerned whether they will play everything together. Although my music usually doesn't need to be like exactly together because I have like various kind of like couplets or like accents, so I don't really need them to be truly together all the time. But it's always a concern for me. But for smaller ensemble, I feel a little bit freer. I can have a little bit of liberty for the tiny details. Yeah, I think that's the only difference for
Are
me.
you more precise? Do you notate more strictly or over notate for larger ensembles?
I think for larger ensembles, my rating is simpler, way simpler. Yeah, I put in less details. Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, makes sense
yeah.
to me.
Just imagine a much bigger acoustic space, so many other instruments playing at the same time or mostly at the same time. Some of the details will be lost anyway, and then if you over notate, then perhaps you don't know which markings, which details they will really bring out. Then I think the best bet is to filter what you really need or what you don't find it necessary, and then you make some choices before you send out the piece. Yeah, that's what I think. Yeah.
Hmm.
But sometimes you may think that if you over notate or if you notate a lot and to the point that you truly mean to have so many details, so much information, maybe this is a way to challenge the performers or the ensembles to give all to give what they have. Sometimes if you write very simple music, they may see the music a little bit different. And yeah, just like if you're given the parts of like Marla, let's say for like Megan and a horn player, if you're given like a part from like Rika Strauss or Marla, and then you know that and then from the score you can see the composers knew your instruments, and then they wrote it so well. Actually, you would give more to the piece.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, but I think also as a performer, I also think like oftentimes like I just know a lot of like I know the general style of Mahler or Strauss, and I know that's going to be very different than if I were playing Brahms or if I were playing Mozart. Um, and I think a lot of times, like the names of the composers, because they're well-known names and well-known styles, do shape my interpretation beyond like just the lines and dots on the page. But we don't necessarily have that as contemporary composers so much. I mean, once in a we might have a couple performers here and there that have played several pieces of ours or a piece many times that maybe does know our music well enough to be able to kind of know our style and exactly how to like shape things. But oftentimes, people don't because we're not, famous
But I would
composers.
say, like, I will go back to your point of how some composers you just know by looking at their music that it is them. Like, for example, a Ligeti score,
Mm-hmm.
you kind of immediately know that it's
Yeah,
Ligeti because of the
Ligeti or like
legacy.
Xenakis, I think is that way.
Is somebody like that. I would
Um,
say that also Grisey. I will say that Lutoslavsky too.
uh-huh.
uh, Even older composers like from a century ago, like Stravinsky and music, the rhythms, how he used rhythms with
Oh
the
yeah.
orchestra. You see that orchestra score and this really rough, violent chords, really violent rhythms. Like you see, at least have an idea. Okay, this is very Stravinskyan. At least you can say that, for example, and get into the style. If you know the repertoire well enough, you can get into the style in a more in an easier way, kind of like are more open performer, I will say. Whereas if you are dealing with something new, it depends on your personality. If you are excited to deal with new music or no, and then we then also go back to an earlier point of your music, Megan, of how you write music. Like performers, it depends on if the performer is have a personality, an adventurous personality that likes to take on new challenges, meaning what is not known to him
Mhm.
or her, or like what the performer usually plays, what is he's accustomed to, and stuff like that. It's kind of very, then again, going back
Yeah.
to another point, psychological. What is known, what is conventional to that particular training of a performer, of the performer, and that also goes into the training of the performer itself.
So, how much room do either of you like to leave for the performer to imprint their personality or musicianship onto your music?
Sometimes I incorporate the errors that I like. I listen to something that isn't on the score, and it's like, wait, that sounded better than what is written, and I incorporate what will be an
Mhm.
error into the actual composition.
Hmm.
uh, I'm pretty open to whatever, because they have a musicality, and they are the ones that kind of like are really okay. We are operating as composers, probably not shunting, and shunting kind of touch upon this without really uh, without intentionality, but like we operate in theory, we operate in the world of ideas. The performers are the ones that are operating in the world of practice, in the real world. So there's that dialogue, and
Mhm.
we only see a piece. We cannot listen to a piece, for God's sake, on finale, on the finale playback. It's like that's not how it's going to sound in a million years, or like in performance in a concert hall ever. Like,
Thankfully.
yeah, thankfully. We only know when we are working with the performers, and we there is where we know, like, okay, also experience comes into play with how many times have you dealt with the instrument, how well do you know the instruments, or instrumentalists, or the specific group, or stuff like that. But also it's like some ideas, even if you know the instruments, even if you know the performers very well, you notate them with an idea in your head, or like dynamics, for example, sometimes, or the combination of instruments, like an idea of how it's going to sound, but you never really get to listen to it, to see it in the real world, to hear it in the real world, until you get to see them practice, until you get to hear the performance. Even in practice, in rehearsals is what I mean. Rehearsals are not the performance. Doesn't it happen to you guys? Like, okay, it sounds away in the rehearsal, but then when it comes to the recital, like a total different experience when there's
Mhm.
the whole parts put together, audience, performers, stage, and stuff. It's like we as composers try to leave as little room for error, you might say, but we have to also try to compute into the whole equation what the errors are going to be, like try to accept them and live with them, and try to see them as part of the nuances of composition in a way. So um, yeah, it's like being idealistic or being pragmatic in a way too. It's kind of like, okay,
Yeah.
it's like I wanted this to happen, but it happened this way. How do I react to that? Am I
Yeah.
happy with it? Well, I may not be happy, but it is what it is. This is what happens in practice. Uh, so I have to accept it. I don't think I think I went in different ways here of thinking, but I think it kind of somewhere there kind of covers what you asked. Like,
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, I think
forever.
for me, like, I mean, I write a lot of, I write a lot of detail in my music. In some pieces, I mean, a lot. I write a lot of detail, probably more than the average composer. But at the end of the day, like, all these different details are a lot of times to get the performer into a space where I'm trying to remove or lessen any kind of preconceived notion about really anything about how their instrument should be played or how they should move on stage, and trying to kind of like make it much more raw. And by doing that, you're kind of, exposing kind of a human on stage and like as purest of a form as I can, ideally. So I think in that way, like, it really puts the personality of and the essence of the people playing my music into the piece. And a lot of time, and I try, in there's parts of my music that I have to put a lot of detail to get them into that space, but then there are parts where I put a lot less, that I can let the performer kind of make their, I guess, own interpretative choices about more things. Yeah, how about you, Shakting? Do you find that how do you find your notation makes space for performer interpretation, or does it?
They usually perform in the way that I like. I'm just a little bit lucky, at least recently. Maybe because I'm flexible. Sometimes when after I choose not to notate too much, I feel like it is not necessary to do everything on my scores. To be honest, it just imagine any piece, any pieces of classical music that you like, and then you look for recordings, and actually in a lot of interpretations, they can sound really different. I recently watched a video about on YouTube about the Beethoven's Piano Sonata, and then the speaker talked about the Tempest, and then it's in D minor, but it opens with an A major chord in first inversion, and then and then there's an appreciation. So you need to. So normally people would begin the appreciation from the lowest notes to the highest notes, and usually they played it pretty fast, right? But the tempo marking was largo, I think largo, if not adagio, it should be largo, and then so Beethoven actually gave us room for interpretation, and then some pianists play that chord very slowly, and some even stretch the first notes, the C sharp, and what I'm trying to say is, I just don't want to be too upset with the performers or about the interpretation. And I believe in the old days when people didn't have internet, and when people didn't have a chance to listen to like thousands of recordings, they actually the pieces could be performed in many different ways.
Mhm.
And and somehow I'm pretty okay. Somehow I'm pretty okay with it. Sometimes it is it is even more touching for me that I hear, oh, they found a way that I didn't expect. Yeah, I so somehow I don't know whether my notation gives enough room for interpretation, but at least myself as a person, I'm pretty lenient to my performers about how my music should be played. Yeah, of course, if there is something that I find it too different from the score, I guess I would be really I will really talk with them. But so far, at least these few years, I would say I was pretty lucky. And for these few years, I didn't really have chance to travel to my performances either. So I find myself have very little control of how they may play the piece.
You have a very good point there because if the perform the only times I've gotten mad that I don't get the result that I wanted or wrote is when I see that the performers don't practice the way they should have. They didn't put
Mhm.
the time or effort into it, and it shows. But if they did and they did a good job and it sounded different from what I expected or from what another performer that is more familiar with my music or is more in tune with the spirit of the piece, you might say, that's a nice concept that could be developed later. The spirit of the piece, right? We could
Mhm.
say that the piece itself has an aura or a spirit that wants to come out through the performers. But the performers are the ones that kind of like are the messengers, like they bring them to the listener. And uh, I'm saying performers, but we should use more the word like interpreters in a way,
Mhm.
because that's what they do. They interpret signs, symbols on a page, and that's literally what they do. They interpret symbols and
Mhm.
bring
And
them to life.
it's not so straightforward. It's not like, a technical manual where you just have to, put together your IKEA for, furniture and you follow the directions and it's done. Like
Yes.
there's it's not so it's not so specific. Like, and it's not so technical. It's yeah, it can be hard.
I certainly remember an episode from like maybe at least like 7 years or 8 years ago. I had a percussion duet performed in Hong Kong, and the percussion duo didn't really have time to rehearse my piece, and they didn't really communicate with me before the concert. And actually the piece was actually dedicated to them as well, so they should be aware of the existence of such a piece. And then somehow I I expected them to have rehearsed before the performance, and but unfortunately when I got the recording, I my initial feeling, my initial impression was they didn't even read the instruction, the performance notes. I mean, at least one of them misinterpreted one of the symbols. For example, if you put like fortissimo within quotation marks, usually it means that the techniques don't really produce a really loud sound.
Hmm.
But you are asked to perform it as loudly as possible, right? So one of the percussionists actually tried his best to be so loud in those places, although the techniques can be really loud. So the end result, he tried in a way that he even changed the techniques to the point that it is really loud. And then after I received the recording, I called one of the percussionists who is my close friend. We are still friends. Anyway, I I I I to- I I told him I was very unhappy with the performance. And then I try my best to remain polite but I definitely told him that I was very disappointed. Um and I believe I kind of criticized the performance as well. Um
When
but,
was this?
mm, I think it was at least like 2 or 3 years after I graduated from UB.
Okay.
And but after some time I regretted not because they backfire me on like social media or in email. They didn't say anything.
Did they?
They really say anything about that? They didn't put the recording on the website either. Somehow that kept the damage to the least extent. Um, but I regret it because I suddenly felt, hey, I could have shown a little bit more appreciation actually. Even if the piece was poorly performed, I would say it was horrible. To be honest, um, that's why I didn't name the performance here. I don't want to like name and shame here.
Oh, sure,
I
sure.
but I was truly disappointed and I was very unhappy. But I regret it for being so unhappy to the performers. And I call the same percussionist again. I say sorry. I actually I really appreciate that you perform my piece. I I I understand it's maybe you didn't have enough time for the rehearsal. You didn't have chance to go through everything carefully. To be honest, I was unhappy, but sorry for being a little bit blunt. Something like that. Um I could I believe I was better worse because the percussionist also speaks Cantonese, so would be even more polite than the version I'm saying here. But yeah, I think I after that I learned to take um bad performances with a more lenient attitude. Yeah.
I see what you mean. I see what you mean. It's like, uh, uh well, it is what it is. It's sometimes it is what it is. It's out of your control, especially under that situation. Like you are not there to coach anything. Uh, I used to have this T-shirt, this composition T-shirt. She was a pianist. She's a pianist, and she used to tell me that she was more nervous when she wasn't performing the music than when she was. And it kind of like, yeah, it struck me. It's why was it? It's because if there was an error, let's say quote unquote error, it was on her. It wasn't on the performer. But once the piece is out of your hands, once it's out there, you cannot do anything about it. It's not on you. It comes. It is what it is. It comes
Mhm.
out one way or another way, and you either can uh, are happy with it, like with the performance, or are unhappy with it and have to live with it. You cannot like get depressed, get sad, or anything like that. Even though, well, yeah, it it has affected us all in one way or another. Like we have talked about it, how bad
Mhm.
performances can affect you. Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that's true. But I think for me, like I have approach like I get less nervous if I'm not performing because I can work with the players beforehand. I can try to communicate with them better. I can try to work with them in rehearsal. But by the time I get to the concert, I have no role in the concert. My role is over as a composer. So it just is what it is at that point. So I don't think I get nervous because of that. That it is what it is, and I think I think I try to focus on kind of doing something interesting and the kind of the relationships, because at the end of the day, it is just music. And while I really value the good experience that I've had and my good performances, like if I write a piece that just doesn't work, or a composer or a performer just screws up a piece, it's frustrating for sure, but it's still just music. Like I can give that piece to a new performer. I can maybe work on that performer later. I can edit the piece or whatever, or I can, learn from it and start a new piece. It's still just kind of music at the end of the day. So like I don't know.
You can also see the tendencies, like where will most of them go wrong, or is usually more what is usually harder for performers. There's also a learning experience even in bad performances, even if
Yeah.
like ones get one feels publicly shamed. I don't know, that I think that's where it
Yeah.
comes from, like one feels
It's
shame.
hard. I guess it's hard when you have a performance that you feel is so not representative of what you wrote, and then people still associate it with you for what you wrote, even though the interpretation doesn't match what you have, the information you provided. That can be frustrating, because at least, like, when you're perform, you have good days and bad days too, but like you're responsible for, all the performance. You could play a really bad piece and it be like a not enjoyable experience, but people can still notice, oh well, they played with good technique. Um, and that kind, you can't, if somebody butchers your piece, you don't know.
It's good
They
then.
just don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's kind of hard sometimes to put your name on something like that. I've been really lucky with my performances, and because I tend to work with a lot of people that are really motivated to play my music, or who I've developed friendships with before. I have had a handful here and there. I'm sure we all have performances that I just felt were very much not representative of my work, but those have been the minority, really.
Yeah, when you
And
look back on them, and at least I've been lucky enough to have them been amended in one way or another. Have a
yeah,
recording later, or have another person perform it. Um, etc.
there's definitely times, especially recent year, like that I've had to adapt a piece to work for a particular set of performers, and maybe the piece changes in its intention by that adaptation, but it still is something that I think is representative of the way I think and my interests, even if it's maybe not what I had originally written. That happens to me. Sometimes I do have to change what I'm trying to communicate, so I do have a more successful performance. Yeah, and I
It
don't.
also makes you think about the piece itself. Like, okay, this has a tendency to be more or more successful, closer to my original idea. This doesn't have a tendency to do that. but it also has to do with with classical training, with conservatory training, with
Hmm.
what they associate some passages with music they've read in the past sometimes.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, it's not always that like, oh, my original idea was a failure for any, for any situation, but the fact it was a failure for the situation I was writing it for, and for the particular performers I was writing it for, and I could either try to keep pushing them further and further, even though it just was never going to fit, or I could choose to make some interesting music with the situation I have. Um, yeah, so I've been better at adapting, I think. And maybe that, yeah, I would say actually, I do think that my notations, as detailed as they are, I do feel like they've gotten less detailed over the years. Partially for that reason, and partially because I know a lot of the performers. Um, yeah, and I think partially that I'm, I'm more willing to let go of certain aspects of music and not have to over control everything as much.
Yeah, I that's a sign of maturing, I will say. Like Shunting also kind of expressed this, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
how as he gets older, he doesn't notate as much. It's like letting go of the score, learning to let go of the score, giving less importance to yourself as a this composer. Because yeah, what I wanted to say is that in the end, isn't notation, isn't this like a pretentious thing of us to do, kind of trying
Mm-hmm.
to thinking that our music is gonna outlive us. Why should it? Who says it should? Like most of us composers are kind
Yeah.
of we assume that when we write music, even unconsciously, like we write it down so it can live longer than us. Well, why should it really?
I know. I
Worth
mean,
it?
I have worked with dancers in more of an oral tradition way.
Yes.
Um,
For
I would like to experiment with musicians that way. I would like to experiment with musicians if I had the right opportunity in other ways too, like maybe using video or other technologies, not just paper
Mhm.
um, all the time. Um, yeah, but yeah, I think for me too, it's also yeah, that's part of it. Like I don't write as many detailed notes or performance notes because I don't necessarily expect my piece to have all these performances after performances. And the performances I do have, the performer usually, at least, occasionally I've had, a performer from a different country who I haven't been able to work with, but we at least have a lot of, dialogue back and forth about the piece. Um, it's always, guided in some way. Yeah, yeah, there is a
There's a
pretentious thing to it.
of
Um,
pretentiousness, of hubris, you might say, but that and idealism too. Kind of like uh, the a good contrast to what I'm saying is the dancer. The dancer only works for the performance that they are working on
mhm.
right now, and once it is performed as many times as it should be performed, then they move on to the next thing. They don't ponder upon it. They don't really. Uh,
Well, that was the culture of music, you know,
that's
a
more
long time
oral.
ago. Well, yeah, there was more of the culture in early music for sure, but even in a lot of the Baroque and classical era, that
Yeah.
was the culture.
Music
I
for
agree.
occasion. There's this occasion, it's done. Okay, on to the next thing. I think that a lot of these perceptions came with romanticism and seeing the artist as this higher being that is in contact with this higher form of communication that is not uh, accessible to normal humans and stuff like that.
Hmm.
It's like it has survived in many ways up to today, I will say. Uh, in and we can see it just in the way that we presume that notation should outlive us, for example, or should represent us, or does represent us. Why can't we see notation as just something that we do and it's there and it doesn't really represent us? It's just
Hmm.
something that is different from us, something that if it gets downplayed, if it gets performed incorrectly, then we don't take it personal. Why do we have to take it so personal? Or
Hmm.
we used to, like with the years, then we kind of like in a way get away, like tend to notice the difference that the score isn't us. Like we are producers of score, but the music, the score isn't us, isn't our us as individuals. It's just it might be us in a certain. It kind of might be us in a frozen in a period of time or a snapshot, you might say, of a period of our lives, but it's not like really an integral part of ourselves. Just
Yeah.
thinking out loud here.
Um. Yeah. It's just so complicated. I mean, I like to think like. I mean, I always say like I want the whole experience of you know watching and listening to my music to be the important part. But like as a composer, I do understand the fact that, and as a composer who does not have much of a history of playing their own music, I just haven't done that since I was a kid. Um, and so I realize that the notation is what I have full control of. I don't have control over how one interprets or processes that information in the notation. So it's just this physical paper is like the one thing I can fully control. So yeah, it's a hard balance because it's like while I do want the end result to be the most important things, and I hope my notation can facilitate that. Um, there's so many layers to getting to that like great performance of your music, and there's multiple people involved, and different layers of going from idea to then notation to then um, being like interpreted and then being like communicated to an audience. So yeah, the notation is also really the what we do as a composer, is we notate these ideas and we try to make situations where performers might interpret them in a certain set of guidelines, but that doesn't always happen. It doesn't always have to be a bad thing when it doesn't happen. Like sometimes it can be really interesting and exciting and take you to different places that you never thought. But yeah, that it's just it makes it music really complicated, I think.
Yes. Yeah. It's about that whole network of communication between the composer, the idea, original idea, going to the composer, going to the performer. What I was trying to say earlier is what I would comment on that. But I think we've been talking long enough. It's been 1 hour
Yeah.
and a half. So I don't know. Are there any closing thoughts from you guys? Um, I think uh,
I
that
think
what
I
you
think
said was
there's
pretty.
just so much to think about with notation. And I think maybe that's the most interesting thing is like the thinking and the processing and the questioning, and trying new things and putting it out there. Yeah, I do. Yeah, I think it's really an interesting tool that um, music has. I don't think music should necessarily be limited to that tool all the time, which it typically is. But it is a really interesting tool that we get to deal with, and there's so much, psychology and so much of not only our own experiences going through it, but our performers and our interpreters experiences and their musical journeys kind of going through it. Yeah, so it can be, yeah, it's just a really interesting type of passing of information, I guess.
Way of expression too, because people talk about we composers express through music, but in the end the first step towards that is notation. Our first the blank page, the literal blank page that we have to deal with is has to deal with notation in itself.
Hmm.
Like how do I write this in a way that I can communicate it or tell it to other people effectively. And it's always gonna be relevant for us. And here we're probably gonna come back to this topic over and over and over in different other topics, I would say. But
Yeah.
well, Shanting, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Do you have any closing thoughts on notation on today on what we talked about?
I I think it's very obvious that every time when we try to rotate our music, it is an opportunity for us to make some kind of decision. The
Yeah.
when we make such a decision, I believe we should try our best to be as sincere, as honest as possible, because we really want um, to notice what we truly want. And I believe it will be very painful if you just try to write some very, let's say you try to notate very beautifully, but if you don't really mean it, you will be very painful, even if the piece become becomes very successful. Because if you are not sincere about your music, then the performances won't be a right representation of your music, or or you as a person. So I think staying sincere, staying honest, and try our best to notate as accurately as possible, perhaps, um, are the most important aspects of notation, at least in my opinion.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well said. Well
Yeah.
said. Well, I guess that will be it for today. It's been a we've talked a lot, definitely for sure. So I guess we'll see you guys in a few weeks, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Be
Yeah.
safe.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.